It's day 3 of the BMA's doctors' strike as they fight for better pay and conditions. The BMA and Health Secretary Wes Streeting met on Tuesday, but no deal was reached. Resident doctors, formerly known as junior doctors, have seen a real-term pay cut over the years. Now, towards the end of the graph, you can see that striking and being part of a union works, as pay did increase. However, it is still a lot lower than what it was in 2008. Now, many have been saying, well, these doctors are well paid and therefore they shouldn't be striking, as it puts the NHS in an even worse position as it already is. Resident doctor pay in the UK starts around $38,000 for first-year foundation doctors, that's FY1, and rises with experience, reaching over $73,000 in later specialty training. But actual earnings are significantly boosted by night shifts, weekends, and on-call work, with top earners potentially reaching $97,000. Pay varies slightly by nation: England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So, granted, these are not low wages, especially when you're talking about the higher end. However, it's important to understand the nuance. Pay isn't actually the only reason for the strike. So FY1, which is Foundation Year 1 doctors, of course, are going to be partly motivated by wages, but they're also going to be motivated by other things. Now, the FY2, so Foundation Year 2, and other doctors who are paid more, who are going on strike, partly it's in solidarity with the lower paid people, but of course there's also other things such as conditions. Now, many people will see those wages and they'll think, well, I'm not on that wage, or I've not had a pay rise like that. There's two things to consider. The first is that many of these doctors are working extremely long hours and work in terrible conditions. The second is that being in a union works. If you have a job and it's low pay, you haven't had a pay rise in years. That is an advertisement for unions. So instead of being angry at the instead of being angry at the strikers, be angry at your boss. However, the last and most important part and reason for this strike is that resident doctors who are on foundation training are not guaranteed a job. Currently, there are not enough specialist training spaces. So, for thousands, many face unemployment after their initial training is over. This is despite the fact that we don't have enough staff to properly run the NHS. Wes Streeting could fix that. Dr. Heather Gunn, who is doing foundation training at the John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford, said the shortage of specialty places meant she feared being unemployed. Competition for specialist training, which follows medical school and 2-year foundation training, has soared in recent years. 30,000 applicants applied for 10,000 places in 2025, partly due to increased overseas applicants, the Department of Health have said. Now, of course, we need migrant health workers, right? The NHS would go under without them. However, our system is still completely backward. I mean, we have, trainees in this country struggling to keep their employment whilst we are bringing over doctors overseas, taking them from often poorer nations, which is unfair on them to do. But what we need is radical investment in nurses, in doctors, and radical investment of the NHS in this country, so we don't just rely on migrant labour. Now, despite all of this, the public doesn't back these strikes. So as you can see on the graph, you've got 12% support and 21% somewhat support. So put that together, that's 33% of the country who support the strikes. If we look at somewhat oppose, 20% say they somewhat oppose, which is more than strongly support. But here's the big kicker here. 38% of people strongly opposed. Now, that 38% is bigger than the combined strong and somewhat support. And then when you add somewhat opposed and strongly opposed, you've got 58%. 60% of the country saying they don't back the doctors. This is a potential blow for them. Ben, what are your thoughts on this strike and the government's handling of it?
Wes Streeting's handled this terribly. He actually described the BMA and the doctors in it as delinquents, which the clip was like used on TikTok. And there were doctors who were literally showing their gloves, which had like blood literally up to there in their arms, and getting traumatized on 12-hour shifts in hospital, going, oh, when you're, at your 12-hour shift and you're being a delinquent with the thumbs up. Like people are really, like, doctors really, really hate Wes Streeting, and with good reason. The guy is a bastard. I'm sorry, he just is. And I'm sorry to do a bit of a low blow, but I'm glad that doctors were able to save Wes's life when he went through cancer treatment. And I think any of those doctors, regardless of how long they've been working, deserve the respect of, when they're arguing for their pay, to not be called delinquents by you years later when you've been through the cancer treatment and your life isn't on the line. It's a lot harder, I think, for people whose lives are on the line. And there's a sort of like objectivity I think you have to this. So I'm gonna I'm not really hitting out on Michael Walker, but I'm disagreeing with Michael Walker here. Because Michael Walker was on Novara, and he kind of suggested that he lacked sympathy for these doctors because they're like more well paid, and it's true, they are very well paid, but it's not about whether they're like well paid according to the average worker, right? It's about whether they're well paid enough to put up with conditions in the NHS, to put your arms inside someone's chest, or break the news to their family that it's time to say goodbye, or that their son is never going to be able to walk again. And this is things that doctors are doing on 12-hour shifts daily, in an underfunded NHS that is just starved of resources. And I think you have to look at comparable countries as well. Our foundation doctors can start on around £38,000 to £50,000, while young GPs in France start on the equivalent of £60,000. So they're already starting higher. And in euros, we spend about €1,000 less on healthcare per citizen as France, Germany, and comparable countries, because we've been through a lot of austerity. It's not about what you think a good salary is according to your like internal measurement of a good salary based on what you earn and what the average person earns. It's simply about the facts, and the facts are that doctors will move elsewhere if you don't pay them enough, or there aren't enough places. The government doesn't provide enough places, because it's not just about the pay. But you can't judge the pay factor, I think, on your like subjective understanding of what a good wage is. A good wage to you is a good wage based on the skills that you have, but a good wage to a doctor looking across the across the world and going, well, I could get paid much better moving to Australia. It doesn't matter what you think, right? You need those doctors. We need those doctors here. If there aren't enough doctors, we'll die, right? Sooner than we should, while people who could save our lives are staying unemployed. And I think it all becomes very real when it's mum in the hospital corridor. And at that point, you kind of don't care whether the doctor is paid significantly more than you for what you do. It's not about that. It's the necessary conditions to save lives and keep the people of this country healthy. It's so much more than about just the pure pay factor.
I mean, I think what's important to me, and I think my view isn't going to be shared by the majority of people. And I think that the polling shows that, right? Because majority of people in this country tend to want to support doctors and nurses. When it comes to the nurses' strike, most of them back them, right? But the perceived thing is that they are earning loads of money and it's not necessary. And also there are people in the NHS who, could be affected by this. From my point of view, again, I recognise that this probably won't be shared by the majority of people. But as a Marxist, I want to keep class consciousness alive. I want to engage in the class war, because what's funny, the right-wingers will say the left want to start a class war. No, we're trying to end the class war. Currently, there's a class war against, whether it's the government or whether it's a private boss, they are engaging in the class war against not just the working class, but some might consider middle class, especially well-paid doctors. And in this scenario, in this a very unequal society in neoliberal capitalism, I really want to back all workers and strikers, even if I feel like, do you know what, that's a lot of money, because at the end of the day, you don't see CEOs going, oh, I tell you what, we've had enough money now, maybe we'll stop. They'll keep on going. So, I mean, really, if you're angry at junior doctors striking, you're really angry about how CEOs would act, whereas their position is far worse because, one, they're less socially valuable, and two, they would earn way more than 70 grand a year. So I think I would back the doctors because I don't back strikes based on, I think they really need a pay rise. I back striking workers because at the end of the day, the only last line of defense the working class and the 99% have of this country is solidarity with other people in the struggle. And doctors struggle, even materially, they're in a very different position to me. Or if you're someone who's a minimum wage worker, materially, they're in a far better situation. I still think that fundamentally, their struggle is the same struggle as someone who's on minimum wage. And I think if we allow ourselves to break that solidarity, and by the way, I think it's a fair point where some might say, I think they're asking for a lot of money. I get the logic, but what I'm telling people is I think people should be mindful that at the end of the day, it is great. It's beautiful for the 1% for workers to be annoyed at other striking workers. That's what they absolutely want. And I think it's important that we hold the line and have working class solidarity.
But I don't think that people are actually as opposed as you might be led to believe by that YouGov poll, because I looked at the YouGov poll when I was reading through the script earlier, and if you break it down by age, the under 50s, right, are break down as basically 20% opposed, 20% strongly opposed, 20% strongly support, 20% somewhat opposed, 20% somewhat support. Basically, it's an even split, right? But then you look at the over 65s, and 57% are strongly opposed, which massively skews the data, right? Most people actually aren't strongly opposed. Most pensioners are. I think we need to have a conversation about pensioners radicalized by the right-wing media and swallowing what the right-wing media are saying, and like that sort of like objective question of like, what do we need to do to keep doctors here? Because actually that's a pressing question for the over 65s, because I'm sorry, if you're over 65, you are more likely to need a doctor in the near future. But they're sort of being blinded and poisoned against the conditions that would make their lives so much better.